All right. Good morning, everyone. If you've been here for one of the previous sessions, you'll know that you're in for a treat. The Reverend Dr. David Marshall is here to continue this series on Christian spirituality with a focus on English literature. So he's introduced a wonderful historical novel. Last week we talked about George Herbert, just completely out of my mind, George Herbert, and today he's going to introduce a living Anglican poet. So, David, over to you.
Thank you very much. Yeah, and while we're talking about the sequence of sessions and themes, just a word about next week. Those of you who were here the first week will recall I introduced the historical novel Father Nicholas just mentioned, A Man on a Donkey. I deliberately left a few weeks as a gap between that session and a following session next week, where I'll come back to that novel and read some particularly powerful passages from it. I hope maybe some of you have had a chance to look at least some of the novel. If you haven't, I just want to say I won't assume in my presentation next week that you have. I will re-explain the plot, the themes, and I will read you some passages explaining how they fit within the bigger story, but mainly it will be to draw out the spiritual riches of this novel. So if you've not read the book, but you'd be interested to come next week, it will make pretty good sense anyway. But now turning to this week, yes, we have now our second priest poet of the series, Malcolm Guite, who let me come clean at the beginning. He's an old friend of mine. I may occasionally find myself saying Malcolm rather than Malcolm Guite or Guite, so excuse that familiarity, but that's just what comes naturally with an old friend. So, as last week with George Herbert, the aim is not primarily to discuss his life, but to introduce his poetry and hopefully encourage you to read and enjoy it and benefit from its spiritual depth. But I begin with a short introduction to his life and work. So he was born 1957 to British Methodist parents in Nigeria, where his father taught classics. Subsequently, the family moved to Canada before he was sent as a teenager to a boarding school in England. Like many of our generation, as a teenager, he lost the faith in which he had grown up. And in his own account, he embraced rational scientific materialism and existentialism. He drifted a long way from belief in Christ. However, he then went on to Cambridge University to study English literature, and while there, he returned to the faith in which he had been brought up, and he speaks of a particularly important moment, a profound spiritual experience, while writing a paper on the Psalms. Significant that even though he was doing a course in English literature, he was asked to write on this most poetic of biblical books. And it was the poetry of the Bible that had this great impact on him. Shortly afterwards, he was confirmed in the Church of England. After graduation from university, he taught high school. He taught English at high school and then began work researching the 17th century Anglican writers, Bishop Lancelot Andrewes and John Donne. He went on to seminary in his early 30s, and that's where I met him. I was at the same seminary and we became friends. I used to love to talk with him. He's a great speaker about literature, about faith, about theology, but perhaps above all, we used to talk about our shared love of C.S. Lewis and J.R.R. Tolkien. We're not going to be speaking about that today, but he's a great expert. He's written very interestingly on Lewis. Malcolm was also the preacher at our wedding a couple of years after seminary, and later he baptized one of our sons. We don't get to see each other very often these days because I live out here in Switzerland, but we had a visit with them this summer. He's in good form. He loved exploring Switzerland. He was ordained in 1990. By now, he had actually already written quite a lot of poetry, but it wasn't known really beyond a few friends. It wasn't yet published. He left his poetry to one side during his early years of parish ministry, and he writes that this was in order to concentrate on and learn deeply my priestly vocation. He really threw himself into priestly work on in a very tough parish, quite socially deprived, poor community tough parish work. He writes, "Life in my parishes was totally absorbing and demanding, so it felt right to let the other fields, in particular his writing of poetry, to let that life fallow for a season." In due course, he became chaplain of one of the colleges of Cambridge University, and most of his working life has been focused in and around Cambridge, combining pastoral work among students, academic work, and increasingly writing poetry, because it wasn't until his mid-50s, relatively recently, 2012, that he first had a significant publication of poems, his volume Sounding the Seasons, 70 Sonnets for the Christian Year, and we'll be looking at some poems from that shortly. And then it was as if the doors opened. This was very popular, it was very well received, it was praised by the Archbishop of Canterbury, and so it was like the publishers couldn't get enough of his poetry, and they published several other volumes of poetry by him very quickly after that. He also produced anthologies of poems by other authors, classic authors, for different church seasons, such as Advent and Christmas and Lent. These are very popular. You can use them as a devotional aid during these seasons of the church year. He's also published volumes of studies of poetry, often in relation to the faith. So he's now very widely known. He writes a weekly column for the main Church of England newspaper, and he's much in demand as a very captivating speaker. He receives many invitations to speak in the USA as well as in the UK, and he's had appointments as poet in residence or other similar titles at, for example, Duke Divinity School. And when I was teaching at Duke, I overlapped with him there for a 3-week visit when he was poet in residence. I can tell you the students loved him. I think they regarded him as a kind of Gandalf figure. If you see the photograph of him on the front of the handout, you get some idea why. He also, by the way, has a strong online presence. If you're interested by what I say, you'd like to explore him more, obviously you can buy hard copies of his volumes, but you can also read a lot of his poetry on that website where I've given you the link, often with links to him reading them. So it's quite vivid, and there are also interviews with him and much else. He's also a musician. He's an enthusiastic singer and guitarist with his band Mystery Train, and he describes himself as a poet, priest, rock and roller in any order you like, really. That's then a short introduction to him. Before turning to some specific poems, I think it's helpful to set his poetry in the context of English poetry more generally, not just Christian poetry. Let me quote, I think, a very significant comment by Malcolm in the introduction to one of his volumes, which helps us to understand what he's seeking to achieve. He writes this: "Since the days of the Romantic poets, so the early 19th century, about 200 years ago, and perhaps even more so since the postmoderns, English poetry has taken an inward turn. It has been seen as the private lyric utterance, sometimes tormented and confessional, of a particular individual, rather than as the public expression or celebration of truths and mysteries to which everyone has access. There is, of course, a place for the inward, the private, and the obscure in literature as in life. But it seemed to me good to try to recover in my own small way what was once a great tradition of more public and accessible poetry." Let's just go over that contrast again. Very important contrast in his mind. He's explaining what he wants to achieve in his poems by comparing two broad styles of poetry. One style tends to be oriented inward, private, focused on the individual, and obscure, difficult for the average reader to understand and enjoy. If you know T.S. Eliot's The Wasteland, think The Wasteland. He's thinking of that kind of poetry, not very accessible. That's not the way Malcolm Guite wants to write poetry. The other style of poetry is oriented outwards. It is public rather than private, in the sense of not just being about the self, but about themes that are bigger than any one of us, stuff that concerns us all. Poetry that is concerned with the experience of a wider community and not just an individual. And crucially, poetry that is accessible, that is widely understandable and enjoyable. that is not just T.S. Eliot style for a somewhat elite readership. This is the kind of poetry Malcolm Guite wants to write. On your handout, I've given some notes on some landmark classics of English poetry over the last 400 years, from Milton's Paradise Lost through Wordsworth's Prelude to Eliot's Wasteland. We don't have perhaps enough time this morning to go through that, but those notes are there. If you're interested, if there's time at the end, I could elaborate a bit on that. But there's one other very important point that Malcolm Guite makes about his own work. In the introduction to Sounding the Seasons, he refers to two earlier priest poets of the Church of England who had each written a large collection of poetry that in different ways offered an organized presentation of the Christian faith. The first of those is George Herbert, who we spoke about last week, and his collection of poems, The Temple. That was nearly 400 years ago. Then 200 years ago, in 1827, the great Anglo-Catholic priest-poet John Keble published The Christian Year. This is a sequence of poems based on Bible readings for each Sunday of the church year in the Book of Common Prayer. Some of these are still known as hymns, such as Blessed Are the Pure in Heart or New Every Morning is the Love. So 400 years ago, we have George Herbert. 200 years ago, John Keble. When we come to the 21st century, most of the poetry being published is broadly in that obscure, difficult, inward, rather self-referential style I mentioned. Most of it has little, if anything, to do with Christian faith. Enter Malcolm Guite, scholar of English literature, priest. And he thinks, why not have a shot at doing what Herbert did 400 years ago and what Keble did 200 years ago? It's time again for a collection of accessible poems, not just poems for the literary elite, poems not primarily about the self, but about God, about Jesus Christ, the faith of the church, and what it can mean for us today. That's what he offers in Sounding the Seasons. It's a sequence of 70 poems, which, similar to Keble's book, they're not following exactly the same pattern, works through the church year, exploring and celebrating many of the great themes of the faith. Now, as I said, I'm a friend of Malcolm's. I'm biased. As far as I'm concerned, he succeeds wonderfully. The poems are generally very accessible. They're open to being understood and enjoyed by, I would say, a fairly wide readership, and we've introduced them often to members of our church. My wife often quotes them in her weekly message to the whole church. Many people who previously had little enthusiasm for poetry have said, this is poetry that I can really enjoy. But at the same time, his poems are far from being simplistic or trite. He's a master of his craft. In particular, he uses the traditional 14-line structure, the sonnet, to great effect. So he works with a traditional form, traditional meter and rhyme, but it's not archaic. His language is fresh, sometimes even colloquial. He conveys the themes, the truths of our faith in memorable, new language. He is, if you like, achieving something which is both old, rooted in tradition, but also new, sort of speaking in some respects the language of today. He's above all an artist in the service of the church. Whether anyone will be reading Malcolm Guite's poems 200 years from now, I have no idea. Who can tell? Regardless, he, I believe, has done the church a great service by pointing to a tradition of what Christian poetry can be like. And he's seeking to renew that tradition. His poetry enriches the life of the church. And I believe such work needs to be encouraged and made more widely known, which is exactly what I'm hoping to do amongst you this morning, make his poetry known. Well, that's enough by way of introduction. We're going to turn now to some examples of his poems. And this is the method I'm going to follow. I've included on your handout 7 of his sonnets, 3 from one volume, 4 from another. What I'm aiming to do, I'm going to read some of them aloud. I'm not sure we'll have time to read them all. Let's see how much we can manage. I'm not going to comment a great deal. I'll make just a few introductory comments perhaps about each poem. I won't say much at the end. When we get to the end of each poem, I'm going to leave a little bit of time for you to read it again. I think most poems need at least a second read to appreciate what's going on in them. So I'll leave a bit of quiet after each poem. If we had a bit more time at that point, I would invite comments or questions. I think probably we'll read all the poems, and then if there's time left, please do share comments or questions, any thoughts you have. So if it's the first poem you've got a great thought about, do make a note. You can make your comment at the end. So here we go then. So I'm going to start with, I think, 3 poems I think we can manage from his sequence of sonnets, perhaps just 2. His sequence of sonnets for the church year. We're going to skip over the first 2 and just look at the one on the crucifixion and the one on Easter. So if you turn to the poem Crucifixion, Jesus is nailed to the cross. I think this needs little introduction other than to say it is one of 14 poems that he writes to accompany the traditional sequence of pictures of Christ. I'm sure many of you will know of. We see in some churches known as the Stations of the Cross. So this is the Station of the Cross when Jesus is nailed to the cross. See as they strip the robe from off his back and spread his arms and nail them to the cross. The dark nails pierce him and the sky turns black, and love is firmly fastened onto loss. But here a pure change happens. On this tree, loss becomes gain. Death opens into birth. Here wounding heals and fastening makes free. Earth breathes in heaven. Heaven roots in earth. And here we see the length, the breadth, the height, where love and hatred meet, and love stays true, where sin meets grace and darkness turns to light. We see what love can bear and be and do. And here our Saviour calls us to his side. His love is free. His arms are open wide. Take a minute in silence to reread that. So that was a poem he's provided for Good Friday, along with a number of others. And by the way, his poems are much used by a number of churches in a liturgical setting, particularly on an occasion like a Good Friday devotional service. It's an ideal resource for reflection and meditation. So it's not just for individual reflection, but can be used in the church. Then, of course, Good Friday is followed by Easter. So here is one of his poems for Easter. Confession. I've left the last 2 lines out on your handout, which is a terrible blunder because we don't get the Easter joy at the end. I will read those 2 lines. I've also sent them in an updated version of this handout to Father Nicholas, so he can provide them to you if you want them. So you'll just have to listen out for the last 2 lines. This is a poetic evocation of the encounter of Mary Magdalene with the risen Jesus, who calls her by name, Mary, and calls us all by name. Easter dawn. He blesses every love which weeps and grieves, and now he blesses hers who stood and wept and would not be consoled or leave her love's last touching place, but watched as low light crept up from the east. A sound behind her stirs a scatter of bright birdsong through the air. She turns, but cannot focus through her tears or recognize the gardener standing there. She hardly hears his gentle question, "Why? Why are you weeping?" or sees the play of light that brightens as she chokes out her reply, "They took my love away. My day is night." And then she hears her name. She hears love say the word that turns her night and ours today. Again, we keep silence. So then those were just two poems for the two greatest days of the church year, Good Friday, Easter. Of course, he also has poems for Christmas, Advent, Epiphany, Ascensiontide, many of the saints' days, and so on. Poetry for the whole church year. I'm going to turn now to another volume, a more recent volume called After Prayer. Now, this links back to George Herbert, whom I introduced last week. Herbert is very important for Malcolm Guite, and one of his volumes of poems, this volume, After Prayer, is to a considerable extent an act of homage to Herbert. Last week, we looked at Herbert's sonnet Prayer, which consists of 26 images or phrases just piled up one after the other without really any connecting grammar, just one picture of prayer after another, each in different ways conveying an aspect of what prayer is about. So Malcolm writes this volume entitled After Prayer, which includes a sonnet based on each of the phrases in Herbert's poem. In other words, Herbert's one poem generates a multitude of poems on prayer by Malcolm Guite. And we're going to look, well, I've included three here. I think probably we just have time for two, so as to leave at least just a few minutes for any comments or questions at the end. I think we'll skip the first one, beautiful though it is. We ended last week with George Herbert's most famous poem, Love, beginning, "Love bade me welcome, but my soul drew back, guilty of dust and sin." This poem is evoking that poem and imagining himself sitting down in the presence of Christ with George Herbert. I'm going to include the last two. In one sense, they're untypical because they're both rather bleak in one sense, but I want to add a part of Malcolm Guite's story here as background to this. He's been quite open in interviews and in writing about the fact that he has suffered quite considerably from depression. And I can send to Father Nicholas a very good interview in which he speaks about these things if it interests you. And he also talks about the struggle it is to, how do we relate the experience of depression with the fact of our Christian faith and the good news it declares to us of God's love. He also talks about how his own poetry has been central to his struggle with depression and faith. here are two poems which pick up themes in Herbert's verse, where Herbert is complaining to God. Perhaps Herbert himself, to some extent, suffered times of darkness. And Malcolm Guy picks this up, and he speaks about what it is like to complain to God out of the dark valley. He doesn't use the word depression, but one might say of his own experience of depression. So let's read the first of these, Engine Against the Almighty, which is again a phrase from Herbert's poem. In other words, an engine, a tool or a weapon turned against God. And this poem speaks of how prayer can be almost an act of aggression, an act of honest telling God what is going on and how life is. And that might almost look like inappropriate aggression against God, but the scriptures in the Psalms and other parts of the scriptures, the book of Job and elsewhere, encourage this. And George Herbert expressed this kind of poetry to God as well. And Malcolm Guy follows here in his line. So, engine against the Almighty. Here in this shadowed valley, dark and bleak, we lay a bitter siege against the one who was our heart's desire, but now withdraws behind his battlements. Our prayers just break against what seem like walls of silent stone. We make an engine of our injuries and vault at God a volley of our sorrows, all the despair and anger that we feel. The catapult of our catastrophes hurls up its heavy load, and flights of arrows clatter against his walls, fall back and fail. How can we make him feel our miseries? We fling back famine at him, torture, cancer. Is he almighty then? Has he no answer? Now that last poem, like some psalms and some words of the prophets, Jeremiah and others, seems to end in the dark. There doesn't seem to be a kind of hope in God at the end of that poem. Has God got no answer for us? The next poem picks up but ends more positively. It likewise speaks of seeking to besiege God or almost attack God from our experience of devastation and darkness. But you will see it ends more positively, the words in italics, speaking as it were in the voice of Christ, who is the God who is not remote and untouched, but the God who in Christ is wounded for love of us and holds us in his love. Christ's side-piercing spear. For all the while I hurl my hurts at heaven, believing I besiege the battlement of God's invulnerable heart and haven. I strike at emptiness, at my own bafflement. I shake my fist in fury at a shadow. For he is not like us, nor are his ways like ours. He left that heaven's haven long ago and broke our siege. A voice behind me says, "Why do you weep and rage at heaven above? I have come down to die here in the dirt. Your wounds have wounded me, for I am love, and in my heart I hold your deepest hurt. Oh, turn around, return, and face me here. Your slightest prayer will pierce me like a spear." there we are, a brief introduction to Malcolm Guite. If I've done nothing else, I've put his name on your radar screens, and I hope you might look at some of his other verses or just return to the few that are here in the handout. We have, I think, just another 5 or 6 minutes. If anybody wants to express any reaction to any of the poems I've read or have any questions or comments, I'd be happy to hear from you.
Hello. I've been following Malcolm Guite online for some time, and it is always such a pleasure to read what he posts. And he tends to post, at least what I get, is for the feast days. And recently for the Annunciation, he posted a large number of poems that were very, very beautiful. And I have been reading for Lent his Word in the Wilderness.
Yes.
And I cannot believe how fantastic that book is. I sometimes communicate with him online, and he always responds. So I'm just saying, yes, I am adoring this book, and I wrote him recently when I responded to the Annunciation about my experience with the Wilderness book and how I'd gone all these places and I'd seen all these things through the poetry that he has provided. And I like the fact that there's a lot of his poetry, but he draws on classic poets. And I'm just giving him a plug. And the comment that he wrote was, "Thanks for the encouragement."
Yeah. Yeah. Well, thank you. Thank you for sharing that. Thank you.
Any other thoughts, comments, questions?
Anyone even just want to say, did a particular line strike you, or maybe even just baffle you or upset you, or whatever?
So I just want to say thank you for introducing us to him, because I was not familiar with his work at all. And I find at least the few poems that we have read together today really wonderful and fascinating. And there's a lot in there. So,
well, yeah.
For me, it was some language in the first poem that you read for us, Crucifixion. And there were two things about it that sort of struck out or stood out to me. And one was that the fourth line, "and love is firmly fastened onto loss." And I thought, well, that's kind of Christianity in a nugget, right? I mean, that's sort of what that just seemed like in and of itself such a powerful line. And then the other part that I loved about that poem was the contrast in the image of Christ's arms being stretched wide and nailed to the cross in pain and persecution, and yet at the end it's that same gesture that is a welcoming, loving gesture, and welcoming us to come to him. And I just thought that was such an interesting juxtaposition of the same image can have such two different, the same gesture can have such two different meanings.
Indeed. That's very helpful. And actually, I don't know if, I forget whether the Episcopal liturgy includes it, but you often get echoes of the liturgy and of the scriptures in his writing. His arms are open wide. I presided at the Eucharist in our church here this morning. We have that phrase in the Eucharist. He's probably got that there as well. His arms were open wide for us on the cross. There's all kinds of resonances going on there. There are different levels of it. Thank you.
He won't be able to hear you, so let me get this.
I just wanted to add an addendum, because you're reminding me that was so much about the sermon that we heard today was about opening our arms wide to be welcoming to other people in this world and in the community. And the bishop kept doing he's sort of making the sign of the cross. He said, so we're going vertically and we're going horizontally in terms of, and I just thought maybe that's why it resonated particularly with me today.
Thank you.
Yes.
Yes, I am so grateful to you for introducing us to Malcolm Guite's poetry. And as we were reading Crucifixion, I immediately thought that I am going to send that poem, probably one of his books, to a dear friend of mine who was a Lutheran Church of Evangelical Lutheran Church of America bishop for 3 terms, and then he retired. Now, about a week ago, he put his wife into a facility because she has Alzheimer's. And he is, I mean, he has not lost her in death, but he is grieving now. So I think that he would appreciate this. Thank you.
I'm sure he would, and there's much else in Malcolm Guite that, in a sense, it goes into the darkness and is honest about it, but brings it before God and finds God there.
I'm always struck by poetry that is, on the surface, simple enough to understand, and yet it just is filled with richness and evocative imagery and vivid imagery. And I think it's actually one of the reasons it's less common is that it's actually a lot harder to do than to just to whatever word comes to mind, But if the aim is to make it accessible, you have a tension between two aims that you're constantly battling with, and he does it just superbly.
Absolutely right. It's harder to be simple and clear and accessible. Anyone can write stream of thought, babble, sophisticated sounding nonsense. It's not hard to do, but it's much harder to produce the kind of chiseled, profound simplicity that Malcolm Guite creates, and which repays reading and rereading. So, thank God that he might like T.S. Eliot and all the other guys, but he said that's not what we need in the church. We need poetry that builds up that we can understand, but isn't trivial. It goes deep, but that is open to a wide readership. Thank God for his gift to us.
Absolutely.
Well, have a blessed Sunday, you all. Or are we done? Or
we'll do one more quick.
What? Yeah, sure. Very happy.
I'd like to say we have so much evidence that the Holy Spirit is with Malcolm.
Amen. Yes. Yes. And I can just say that's true. That's true.
Wonderful. Well, David, thank you so much.
Yeah.
And
Okay.
I look forward to the last of the series where we return to A Man on a Donkey, and I'm fascinated to hear what you have to say about it next week. So hopefully you all can join,
Okay.
and it'll be a
right.
little bit less busy next week. So hopefully we'll have a few more people here as well.
Well, you have a blessed day with your bishop. Have a great day. Bye for
Thank you
now.
very much.